The sun scorched the Sahel dust, as thousands gathered in reverence, the air vibrating with ancestral drums and chants in the ancient language of Sankara. On the main stage, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood tall, a living symbol of defiance of victory, of a nation clawing its way back from chaos. He raised his hand in salute to the fallen heroes of the North, the men and women who bled to reclaim Burkina Faso from the grip of terror. And then it happened. Click, click, click. 3 dry, deliberate sounds behind him. 3 men in VDP uniforms drew weapons in perfect synchrony. But they were not Burkinabe. They were covert commandos, Ivory Coast operatives in disguise. Gunfire erupted. Ayuba, a Cobra Special Forces operative, moved like a shadow. Bullets screamed through the air. One tore through Traoré's chest plate. Another ripped the flag beneath his feet. Blood sprayed across the national colors. But Traoré did not fall. Not this time. Within minutes, counterintelligence systems went hot. A single rogue signal lit up the network. CIA encryption. And on the screen, a name appeared unthinkable. The traitor Burkina Faso's own army chief. Traoré's former classmate. Backed by Ivory Coast. Burkina Faso had been betrayed, from within. Immediately after the blood-soaked ceremony, Traoré ordered the lockdown of the entire city of Kaya. The drums fell silent. The chants evaporated. Celebration turned to siege. Armored vehicles rolled into position, and suspicion clung to the air like dust in the Sahel sun. A Cobra special unit was deployed, silent, surgical. Their orders interrogate every single member of the ceremonial guard, search every weapon, inspect every pouch, every stitch of fabric. No exceptions. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be proven. Within just 3 hours, the breakthrough came. A young Lieutenant Bamba discovered a small encrypted USB sewn deep into the waistband of one of the dead assassins, almost invisible, almost forgotten. They plugged it into a secure military terminal. What they found made the room go cold. Blueprints. Precise diagrams of Traoré's movements. Drone flight schedules. Guard rotation logs. Not leaks, full tactical layouts stolen from inside their own command system. But then came the signal, the real bombshell. A silent beacon pulsing in the background code. Origin Langley, Virginia, headquarters of the CIA. And there it was, on screen, Traoré's face caught in a drone's targeting frame, boxed in red, marked Priority Target 1. Silence, shock, fury. Traoré stood motionless. His uniform still bore the tear from the bullet that could have ended his life hours ago. Now he stared at the digital betrayal before him. Then came his words, low, final, the calm before a coming storm. They think this is a game of politics. Then let them bleed for their mistake. In that moment, the game changed. Burkina Faso was no longer merely under attack. It had been marked. But Traoré would not run. He would not retreat. Burkina Faso would hunt. The war had come home, and now it had a name. The data recovered from the USB didn't just reveal foreign coordination, it traced back to one of their own. Traoré's inner circle began a full audit of communication logs, encrypted satellite pings, and unusual signal movements over the past 30 days. And there it was. A string of unauthorized transmissions routed through a military relay station in Wahiguya, sent using top-tier command codes, and digitally masked behind the call sign Echo 88. That code was restricted to just 3 men in the entire Burkinabe military, and one of them was General Abdul Karim Sanfo, a hero of past operations, decorated, respected, Traoré's old friend from Officer Academy. They had trained together, eaten from the same ration pot during their early days in the Northern Front. It was Karim who had first introduced Traoré to the concept of Pan-African sovereignty. Now the very man who once spoke of Sankara as a saint had sold their country's blood for foreign coin. A midnight tribunal was called. No press, no uniforms, no ceremony. Traore sat alone at the head of a steel table in an underground bunker beneath Ouagadougou's eastern command post. Across from him, General Sanfo, wrists unbound, but dignity stripped by the silence. "You gave them our breath," Traore said, holding up a tablet. On the screen was the CIA feed showing live coordinates of his own convoy from a week ago. Karim didn't flinch. "I gave them what you refused to negotiate." Traore's jaw clenched. "You thought aligning with Langley and Abidjan would save Burkina, that selling troop positions would earn us favor." "No," Karim whispered. "I thought it would stop your war before it became all of West Africa's." The betrayal burned deeper than bullets. Karim had secretly coordinated with intelligence officers from the Ivorian government, specifically through a covert advisory group stationed in Abidjan, funded indirectly by foreign development contracts. These contracts were thin veils. Beneath them, strategic mining rights, drone corridor access, and military positioning. The plan was simple: eliminate Traore, destabilize the Cobra command structure, and install a moderate regime willing to sign over Sahel security operations to a joint West African International Task Force, all wrapped in a bow of humanitarian assistance. What none of them expected was that the captain would survive the bullets. And now retaliation was no longer an option, it was obligation. At AU4IR0 the following morning, Operation Tempate Finale was launched. It was not a message, it was an earthquake. Thousands of Cobra units, BIR squads, and VDP militias mobilized across the northern corridor. Their target, fortified terror nests, long believed to be impenetrable, now compromised thanks to the stolen CIA data they had just reclaimed. In Arbinda, 6 drone teams swept the desert, sending heat signatures back to real-time command units. In the Sahel hills, VDP fighters moved like ghosts through the trees, machetes drawn, AKs slung across their backs. By noon, over 1,000 insurgents were dead. Their bunkers collapsed, their supplies torched, their escape routes burned by napalm. The offensive wasn't just strategic, it was surgical, precision, ruthless. Controlled by emotion, yes, but never consumed by it. Traore himself appeared in the field at one point, walking among the ruins of a former jihadist radio station turned safe house. There he picked up a broken headset, still buzzing with static. And in that white noise, one word cracked through a name, whispered by mistake over an open comm: Ruto, William Ruto, President of Kenya, the man who just weeks ago had spoken at an AU summit about supporting sovereign African leadership. Now his name was being heard across jihadist channels as a back-end facilitator of logistics and finance, tied through third-party corporations registered in Mombasa. A chill cut through the heat of the Sahel. This wasn't just Burkina's war anymore. It was the first domino in a much larger game. The room went still. The only sound was the static whisper fading from the broken headset in Traore's hand. Ruto. It was not screamed. It was not part of any coded message. It came out of the mouth of a dying insurgent still clutching a comm unit with trembling fingers bleeding into the red Sahel dust. The name slipped through as his last breath, unguarded, accidental, but damning. Traore stared at the device for a moment longer, then passed it silently to Ayuba. "Get me everything. Every file, every channel, every whisper attached to that name in this region," he said, voice low and cold. Burkina Faso's intelligence units kicked into overdrive. In the space of 48 hours, over 17 terabytes of field data were processed, intercepted radio chatter, encrypted satellite calls, funding trails, and logistical shipments tagged from Kenya's coastal ports. The conclusion was unmistakable and terrifying. The insurgents were being resupplied through a shell logistics firm headquartered in Mombasa. On paper, it was a fishing export company. In reality, it was the entry point for high-frequency encrypted equipment, modified commercial drones, field rations, and most crucially, unmarked ammunition compatible with both NATO and Soviet-era firearms. a perfect supply line for destabilized, fractured war zones. The owner, a Nairobi-based corporate group with known connections to the Ruto administration's offshore security advisors. Traore did not speak to the press. He did not issue threats. He issued orders. At 0300, Burkina's Ministry of Defense released a private memo to the military leadership of Mali and Niger, Burkina's closest allies in the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. Subject line, Pan-African Sovereignty Breach, Tier 1. The message was simple. We have confirmed strategic and political subversion originating from within the East African community, directly threatening the internal stability of the AES bloc. Request immediate coordination for joint counterintelligence operations and sanctions protocol simulation. Hours later, encrypted confirmation came from both capitals. While the intelligence war raged on in West Africa, a parallel thread emerged in East Africa. A whistleblower from within Kenya's own intelligence directorate leaked a folder of classified documents known only as the Kampala Files to a network of Pan-African journalists. The leak detailed months of secretive meetings between Kenyan national security delegates and Western operatives, some bearing NATO clearances, others tagged as humanitarian consultants. Their purpose, the files alleged that several African governments were being steered through political puppetry to create a belt of controlled instability stretching from eastern DRC to central Mali. The goal was to create a pretext for permanent joint security occupation, masked under peacekeeping mandates, essentially a way for powerful states to regain control over Africa's rapidly consolidating sovereign movements. Burkina Faso under Traore was named as the single most volatile variable, too bold, too independent, too dangerous. That was why he had to be removed. Inside Traore's war room, now fitted with full-time counter-surveillance systems, the data was laid bare for every Cobra command chief to see. Names, dates, phone logs, financial trails. Ayuba, seated beside his commander, asked the question none of them wanted to voice. What now? Do we confront Ruto directly, or do we go silent and bleed them slowly? Traore stood looking out over the city from his reinforced compound. They did not send us an ambassador, he said. They sent assassins. He turned. We respond in kind. The mission was not a declaration of war, not publicly, but within AES channels it was given the green light as a Tier 4 proactive countermeasure. 3 Cobra units were dispatched under deep cover protocols. Their mission: confirm the physical presence of Mombasa-based logistics managers tied to the Ruto administration. Map out connections between Nairobi's internal security team and known Western operatives. Prepare evidence for submission at a future AU emergency summit. This was not a military strike, not yet. It was a strike against credibility, a war of legitimacy, and it had to be won not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of every African watching. 5 days later, a video surfaced online broadcast, not by state television, but by a rogue AES media cell using satellite bypass systems. In it, Traore stood in the ruins of a captured terrorist base. Behind him, evidence was laid out in open crates, ammunition boxes labeled Charon Exports Limited. Nairobi encrypted phones, preloaded with Kenyan SIM cards and satellite maps of Ouagadougou with classified Cobra movements marked. Traore looked directly into the camera. Burkina Faso is not at war with any African people, but we will not bow to those who turn their neighbors into enemies. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a red line, and we will draw it in the blood of whoever crosses it. In Nairobi, the administration went into media lockdown. No official response, no denials, no confirmations, just silence and rapid reshuffling of security staff. In Washington, several intelligence officers were recalled from West Africa without explanation. In Paris and London, newspapers carried cryptic headlines, "The African Cold War begins." But in the streets of Kaya, Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako, something else happened. Murals of Traore appeared overnight, painted by street artists, his face half lit by shadow beneath the words, "The lion is awake." The morning after the broadcast, the world held its breath, but the Sahel did not. Across the AES capitals, Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, military and political councils convened behind locked doors. Outside, tens of thousands gathered in support, waving flags, chanting the names of their leaders like war drums, echoing through the desert. In Burkina Faso, Traore had drawn his red line with words. Now it had to be drawn in policy and, if necessary, in fire. The three leaders of AES Traore Mali's Colonel Assimi Goïta and Niger's General Abdourahmane Tiani issued a joint directive by secure satellite link. The mission initiate protocol Dune Shield, a regional contingency plan for the emergence of coordinated foreign-backed destabilization. For the first time since the fall of Gaddafi, a pan-Sahelian military summit was convened in Tahoua, Niger, known to be the geographic midpoint of the Tri-State Alliance. The message was clear: Africa would no longer whisper its sovereignty, it would roar. Within 48 hours the summit began. 3 flags waved under a reinforced tent in the blistering Niger sun. Around the table sat hardened men, flanked not by diplomats but by battlefield strategists. Maps of West and Central Africa stretched across the tables, marked in red, yellow, and blue zones. At the heart of the discussion, identified corridors used by covert logistical networks, especially via coastal ports. Intelligence on suspected allied state infiltration within military command chains. Coordinated mobilization capabilities in case of direct confrontation with foreign-trained regional forces. But the most important debate centered on whether to name Ruto publicly and what the consequences might be. Some argued for caution. Others, led by Goïta, pushed for full exposure. Then Traoré spoke, measured, controlled, but firm. Naming him is not for the West. It is for us, so that our children know who sold silence in exchange for sovereignty. If we fear names, we have already lost the war. The room fell silent. Then came the vote, unanimous. Back in Nairobi, the silence had fractured into panic. Ruto's internal advisory team began purging documents. Contracts were shredded. Server rooms at certain ministries caught fire. At least 2 lower-level intelligence officers were found dead under suspicious circumstances. A cover-up had begun, but it was already too late, because Traoré had anticipated the panic, and he had set a trap. Through the AES Joint Cyber Intel Task Force, a decoy intelligence drop was placed on a known compromised channel. The file labeled Alpha Rift claimed to contain the identities of Cobra agents operating in East Africa. In less than an hour, the file was accessed by a private network registered in Karen, Nairobi, an elite district home to several foreign diplomats and intelligence contractors. Proof of espionage. AES had what it needed, a smoking gun digitally signed and time-stamped. On the international stage, tension escalated rapidly. At the United Nations Security Council, a motion was quietly introduced by France to request clarification on AES military movements and their recent intelligence sharing protocols with Iran and Turkey. The motion failed, but the tone had been set. Washington's State Department released a carefully worded statement. The United States respects the sovereignty of all African nations and encourages diplomatic resolution to regional disagreements. No names were mentioned, but the implication was clear: the West was nervous. Not because of what had been said, but because of who had the power to say it now. Meanwhile, the African Union was forced to call an extraordinary assembly under pressure from both pro-West and pan-African blocs. The assembly would convene in Addis Ababa in 5 days. The center of gravity had shifted. Africa was no longer a chessboard. It was a player. On the streets of Bobo Dioulasso, in the markets of Bamako, and across the mosques and schools of Niamey, a wave of popular mobilization began. What started as military defiance had now become a civilian movement. Artists painted resistance murals. Poets recited Sankaра's speeches in open squares. University students began organizing sovereignty circles, political education networks designed to resist foreign propaganda and revive African historical consciousness. The AES was no longer simply a military bloc. It had become a cultural front, and every movement needed a spark. 2 nights before the African Union's emergency assembly in Addis Ababa, Traore did something no one expected. He flew to Tahua not as a soldier, but as a witness. At a public rally hosted on the edge of the Sahara, before a crowd of over $40,000, he stood on a bare steel platform and addressed the continent. He said nothing about war. He spoke of memory, of betrayal, of a continent that had forgotten the scent of its own soil. Then he ended with this: "They thought they could break us with fear. But we have nothing left to fear, because we remember who we are. We are not a problem to be solved. We are a people awakening. And we are coming home." The crowd erupted. And somewhere in Nairobi, someone finally understood. This was no longer about Traore. It was about Africa choosing who speaks for Africa. Addis Ababa, 5 days later. The African Union headquarters, a building built by Chinese architects and funded by global players, now became the crucible for a distinctly African reckoning. For the first time in a generation, the fate of a continent was not being debated in Paris, Washington, or London, but here under African skies with African voices. The extraordinary assembly was packed, every seat filled. Delegates from 54 member states gathered, but this was no ordinary summit. It had the tension of a courtroom, the silence of a battlefield. AES arrived unified, focused, unflinching. Traore, Goita, and Tiani walked in shoulder to shoulder, wearing simple military fatigues, not ceremonial suits. No entourage, no fanfare, just presence. Across the aisle sat President William Ruto, his delegation stiff-guarded, visibly unsettled. Despite pressure from his advisors, he had chosen to attend. Or rather, as leaks would later reveal, he was ordered to attend by external partners, eager to contain the crisis. But containment was no longer an option. The summit opened with procedural remarks, then exploded into history. Traore was the first to speak. He didn't accuse, he unveiled. Using a secure satellite link, his team presented a cascading timeline. The intercepted CIA signal originating from Langley. The funding trails traced through shell companies in Mombasa. The contracts between East African logistics firms and humanitarian arms suppliers in Belgium and Germany. And finally, the intercepted comms that mentioned Ruto by name. At each point the evidence grew heavier, and the silence in the room thickened. Then came the masterstroke, a short video, just 18 seconds. In it, a mid-level logistics officer, captured during Operation Tempate Finale, described his recruitment. The video had no edits, no enhancements. We were told to support shipments marked Blue Aid, but they weren't medicine. They were tactical drones, satellite phones, and sniper optics. The contract came from Nairobi, through a man called Mwangi. We were told the president is aware. The name hit like a hammer. Mwangi, Ruto's longtime logistics advisor. The camera panned to Ruto. He didn't speak. His eyes darted, calculating. But the AES wasn't finished. Mali's Colonel Goita stepped forward next. He didn't speak of espionage. He spoke of dignity. This is not about drones or dollars. This is about the memory of our ancestors being bartered for influence. This is about Africans choosing other Africans for destruction under foreign shadows. Today we decide if we are sovereign nations or just coordinates on someone else's map. Thunderous applause broke protocol. Delegates from Zimbabwe, Guinea, and Chad stood up. Then Sudan. Then even Tanzania, Kenya's neighbor, signaled symbolic support. The tide had turned. Ruto finally rose. He denied everything, blamed rogue actors, questioned the authenticity of the footage, called it an information war engineered by anti-progress radicals. But the words fell flat. No one was listening, because everyone was watching Traore. He had not once raised his voice. He had not once pointed a finger. But now he stood looking directly at the assembly and said, "This is not a trial. This is a mirror. What you see here is not just Kenya's reflection, it is ours. If you do not hold this breach accountable, then know this Burkina Faso will, and we will do so without apology." The room erupted in procedural chaos. Behind closed doors, AU legal and security advisors debated for hours. Would the union issue sanctions? Would they expel Kenya? Would they call for international arbitration? But Traore, Goita, and Tiani had already anticipated the inaction. So when the summit reconvened, they declared preemptive independence in matters of regional security. The AES Charter of Sovereign Defense was announced a legally binding document among the three nations that formally rejected all external security cooperation not approved by the AES, granted full military mobility across the tri-states, recognized foreign interference as an act of hostility, and most significantly, mandated a Pan-African tribunal to be established within 6 months to investigate and prosecute continental subversion. The room was stunned. The AU had just been bypassed by its own members, and the world had just witnessed the birth of a new African military-political axis. Aftermath. The dust doesn't settle in Nairobi. The backlash was immediate. Protests broke out. Civil society groups, long silenced, erupted with demands for inquiry. Mwangi fled the country within 72 hours. Leaked internal memos revealed foreign diplomats evacuating quietly. Ruto's grip on power began to crack. In the West, think tanks scrambled. NATO quietly increased activity in coastal West Africa. French intelligence proposed containment strategies. The U.S. State Department urged stability but had already begun behind-the-scenes talks with AES representatives. The new order was real and irreversible. He returned to Kaya the same way he left without ceremony. There, beneath the flag that still bore dried blood from the assassination attempt, he addressed his people not as a victor, but as a reminder. Victory is not killing enemies. Victory is ensuring your children no longer have to ask, "Who do we belong to?" Today we chose the answer, and we did not whisper it, we roared. In the hills beyond, Kaya villagers echoed those words by firelight. And across the continent, something began to stir. Not war, not fear, but a remembering. Africa was not born yesterday, and now finally she had remembered her name. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the attempted coup in Burkina Faso offers profound lessons about leadership, betrayal, sovereignty, and the awakening of a continental consciousness. It is not merely a tale of bullets and espionage. It is a deeply symbolic narrative that mirrors the psychological and political dynamics shaping modern Africa. At its heart lies the battle between external manipulation and internal resilience, and the choices made by those who dare to resist the machinery of geopolitical control. First and foremost, the story underscores the perilous cost of betrayal from within. Traoré's brush with death came not from a foreign battlefield, but from those he once called brothers, fellow Burkinabe, trained under the same flag, educated under the same principles of national service. The fact that the attempted assassination was orchestrated in concert with foreign actors only deepens the moral weight of the betrayal. It teaches us that the erosion of sovereignty does not always begin with external pressure. It often begins with internal compromise. Loyalty in this context must be earned, reaffirmed, and constantly reevaluated, especially in times of transition and reform. The discovery of CIA coordination and foreign logistical backing in the plot to eliminate Traoré reveals another essential truth, that African nations are not simply victims of foreign meddling, but active battlegrounds for influence between competing powers. The myth that post-colonial Africa is free is shattered by the digital trails of sabotage, the encrypted messages from Langley and the silent transactions that finance chaos under the guise of humanitarian assistance. What this story lays bare is the persistence of a neo-colonial framework, one that no longer wears the uniform of colonial armies, but instead moves through corporate contracts, intelligence proxies, and strategic assassinations. A third lesson lies in the nature of response. Traoré's reaction was not impulsive. He did not retaliate with reckless declarations or undisciplined revenge. Instead, he activated a disciplined, methodical counterintelligence protocol rooted in surgical strikes and forensic digital analysis. This demonstrates a maturity of leadership rarely acknowledged in Western narratives about African governance. The myth of chaos is replaced by the image of a commander calmly navigating a storm, not to exploit fear, but to restore dignity. His poise in the face of betrayal became a lesson in what it means to protect a nation without surrendering to vengeance. Furthermore, the evolution of this political crisis into a cultural movement is a powerful reminder of the emotional and symbolic power that resides in collective memory. The murals of Traoré, the chants in Kaya, and the revival of Sankara's words all point to an Africa that is not passively reacting to global events, but actively reclaiming its historical identity. This story illustrates that sovereignty is not only a military posture or a policy framework, it is a feeling. It is a collective will that draws strength from ancestral pride, cultural resilience, and a burning desire to determine one's destiny. Africa's awakening, as portrayed in the story, is not an ideological campaign. It is a deeply human process of remembering. Another critical lesson arises in how the African Union and broader continental alliances responded. The formation of the AES Charter of Sovereign Defense and the rejection of external security partnerships not sanctioned by the bloc reveals a growing capacity for continental solidarity. It signifies a shift in geopolitical agency from reacting to foreign pressures to setting the terms of engagement. What the AES leaders demonstrated was a refusal to be pawns in a larger game. Their united stance, particularly in the face of efforts to derail or discredit them, redefined what modern Pan-Africanism can look like: pragmatic, coordinated, and unapologetically self-governing. Traoré's final speech at the public rally near Tahua also presents a subtle but powerful moral compass for leadership in times of crisis. By choosing to speak not of war, but of memory and belonging, he reframed the conflict as a moral and spiritual struggle, rather than just a strategic or territorial one. He reminded Africa that fear loses its grip when people rediscover who they are. This moment of introspection, delivered in poetic but firm language, highlighted the power of narrative in reshaping national and continental identity. It was a declaration that Africa's problem is not just external domination, it is internal amnesia. And the remedy is not firepower alone, but remembrance. The exposure of President William Ruto and his alleged connections to destabilization plots reveals another important dimension: the burden of accountability. When an African leader is implicated in aiding foreign attempts to destabilize another African nation, it violates not only diplomatic ethics, but fractures the psychological trust required for Pan-African cooperation. The silence and disarray in Ruto's administration following the evidence drop show how fragile power becomes when it is disconnected from truth. The collapse of his internal credibility, triggered not by war, but by facts, illustrates that in the age of digital transparency, secrets are no longer safe, and leaders who gamble with their people's trust may find themselves isolated overnight. A lesson must also be drawn from the international community's reaction. The cautious language from the United States, the silence from France, and the procedural vagueness at the UN all reflect a growing discomfort. The West was not shocked by the violence they were unsettled by, who now had the ability to reveal it. Traore, Goita, and Tiani didn't just act as military men. They acted as narrative architects, reclaiming the power of speech evidence and symbolic action. And in a world where perception often governs policy, this shift in narrative control represents one of the most significant strategic victories in recent African history. Lastly, the transformation of AES from a security pact into a cultural and ideological movement, hints at the long-term implications of the story. The establishment of sovereignty circles, the street murals, and the literary revival across universities all indicate that the true battlefield is not in the Sahel or in Nairobi's corridors of power. It is in the hearts and minds of the next generation. If this story teaches us anything, it is that resilience is contagious, that once a people begin to remember their name, no amount of foreign coordination, betrayal, or propaganda can unwrite their awakening. In conclusion, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and the AES struggle is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa learning to speak for itself, defend itself, and most importantly, define itself. The lesson is clear: sovereignty is no longer a request. It is a declaration. And those who carry its banner must do so, not with anger or arrogance, but with clarity, courage, and the memory of who they truly are.